So the first way in which we tested it was we simply asked people what information did they pay attention to in trying to figure out whether they had been biased. Did they look inwards? In particular, did they focus on thoughts and feelings? Or did they look to behavior? And what you see is that for voters, there's this big difference between how much they said they pay attention to behavior versus to information from their thoughts and reasoning. Now, what is behavior here? Behavior here is, did I vote along with my party? If I voted the same as my party, then that was my behavior, and that would look biased. If I didn't vote the same as my behavior, that would look like I wasn't influenced by my party. Or I could look to what was going on inside my head. Was I thinking about my party? Was I thinking about wanting to have the same views as my party? Something like that. So voters are saying, I really paid a lot more attention to that stuff in the head than to behavior. Now you might say, can we really trust them? Do they know what they were paying attention to? Well, maybe not. But we had another thing that we could look at to verify that, which is I mentioned that we actually had people write out what their thoughts were. So we knew whether their thoughts were particularly conforming or about their party or not. And when we looked at those, we coded them for signs of conformity, of thinking about the party. So for example, if you're a Republican and you thought, I support the Republicans, if that was one of your thoughts in thinking through the issue. Or if you're a Democrat and you thought, well, the Democrats are usually right. So for voters, there was a strong correlation between whether they had thoughts like that and whether they thought that they'd been influenced by their party. So they were looking inwards, and if they found evidence in there, then they said, okay. Now, remember, the observers had access to that exact same information. We gave them all those thought listings. But as you can see, there was no correlation for them. They didn't pay attention to it. They just ignored that information. Didn't matter whether you'd thought it, didn't matter, this person was a Republican, and they thought, that's a great thing because, the Republicans like it. Versus they didn't have that thought, didn't matter. What they looked at was behavior. They said, if I want to know whether you're influenced by your party, let me just see whether you voted with your party. Okay. So let me just kind of develop that idea with one more study before I move on. Because I think that what this suggests is that people actually define concepts like bias and conformity differently depending on who it is that they're judging. That is, if they're judging themselves, it seems like they're likely to say that bias is this thing that happens in the mind. So let's talk about sexist biases in hiring decisions. Well, what would it mean for me to show sexist bias in a hiring decision? It would mean to have the intention or the motivation to favor one gender over the other, right? It seems like I'm defining it as something in the head in my own case, whereas in the case of someone else, I would want to see their behavior. What would it mean for them to show sexist bias? To have a long record of always hiring men rather than women. That's the idea. And that's what we tested here. We had a number of different scenarios that people read about where bias might occur. This is just one example of a classic bias that psychologists like. So people read various scenarios, like you're gambling and the roulette wheel has landed on red 4 times in a row, and they were always asked a single question. What might it mean to be biased in this situation? It's the question all subjects were asked. And they received 2 different possible definitions of bias. One of them involved behavior, and one of them involved introspections. We varied only one thing in the study, and that was whether participants were sort of subtly led to think about themselves or someone else when answering the question. So here they were subtly led to think about themselves. It wasn't actually in red. That would have been not so subtle. So what you can see is that when they were asked this question, what might it mean to be biased in this situation? And they happened to be subtly led to think about themselves when answering it, they said, bias, that's this thing in the head, thinking about what's likely to come up next. Instead, when they simply got asked the exact same question, but Linda was the person who was mentioned, they instead thought that now bias, that's like a behavioral thing. That's, you put all your bets before on this, and so now you're putting a big bet on black. And I think the implications of this are important because how are we going to judge something like, whether there was sexism at this company and hiring practices if we can't even agree on what it is, and if the actor, him or herself, has a very different view and is operating according to a very different definition. So one thing that I've suggested up till now is that the reason why people often deny bias in themselves is that they are looking inwards, and it tends to occur non-consciously. And we've heard a number of people have suggested this idea that bias tends to occur non-consciously. Masri and Banaji's very important work on non-conscious racism and prejudice, right? So you don't know that you're doing it. In fact, you might be the precise person who really deplores it and think it's one of society's biggest problems, but yet you might non-consciously show some of it. Also with corruption, John Barge and others have suggested that people, without even knowing it, can pursue self-interested and corrupt sorts of goals. So what I'm suggesting is that part of the problem here, part of the reason why these biases flourish, is because of the fact that people don't know they're doing it, and so they're denouncing it, but they're not doing anything necessarily about the problem because they're assuming that they would know if they were doing it. So they don't have anything to correct for. They don't have anything to work on. Now, one thing that this suggests is that if it's the case that there are biases that happen consciously, that those people shouldn't necessarily deny, right? Because we're looking inwards, if we see signs of them, great. And in fact, that's exactly what we found in our work. So there are some biases that do leave conscious traces. Sometimes there's something that a political issue that when you hear about it, it really makes you mad. And therefore, because you got really angry about it, you think actually maybe you can't be objective in judging it. So we found this, for example, with female undergraduates after Larry Summers made his notorious comments about women's math ability. They thought that they couldn't really be objective in thinking about that whole situation because they sort of got angry about it. Actually, when we looked at how biased they were in various ways, they were no more biased in evaluating the situation than were their male peers, but they really thought they were. And it was because they had this emotional reaction that mediated that tendency. So why should we care so much about these perceptions of bias to begin with? Why does it even matter? Well, I'd like to argue that one reason why it matters is that it can foster conflict. So one of the things that happens in the course of disagreements is that we tend to see those on the other side as not operating according to careful reasoning and objective analysis. Instead, we often see them as just sort of guided by blind ideology, following along, not thinking for themselves, maybe motivated by hatred or powerful emotions. And of course, they're thinking the same thing about us, and that can be something that can fuel conflictual or aggressive behaviors, I'd like to suggest. So I'll turn to a discussion of that now. So the simple conflict spiral in political science is just something like this, right? There's some sort of a disagreement. Maybe it's real, maybe it's imagined. And as a result, A does something aggressive towards B. They drop a bomb, a missile, something like this, and then B responds, and they shoot a bomb back, and it just keeps going. A responds to B, and B responds to A. So a great example of this is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, right? The only thing that anyone disagrees about is just who's A and who's B. Everyone agrees. It's a classic conflict spiral. So what we're doing is we're sort of saying, well, let's think a little bit about at least one psychological process that might fuel this whole thing, and that is bias perceptions. So that maybe what happens is you have a disagreement between A and B, and that causes A to perceive B as biased, because A says, if that's really the way that you see it, you're not seeing it the way that it is. Therefore, there's some sort of bias influencing your view. So maybe it's about the Gaza Strip and who should have it and how much of it, and there's some disagreement. Well, if you really believe that, then you're not looking at the situation objectively. So what happens? Well, if you're not looking at the situation objectively, then I can't reason through it with you. We can't talk about it. We're not going to fix this thing by talking. So then what's my option? Well, suddenly it's a much more sensible option to just engage in some aggressive action to resolve this. Now, of course, when I engage in that action, when I drop the bomb, the other side says, whoa, that was really not merited by the objective situation. That was totally uncalled for. You must be completely biased to have done that. So now you're biased, so now I can't reason with you, and the spiral continues. So we've done a number of studies to sort of illustrate this spiral, and I'm only going to talk about two of them today, just to give you a flavor, and these particular ones are in the context of terrorism and suicide terrorism.